I was 48 when I got an offer from my company. If I accepted it, I'd be making about $24 million, which would take me to a whole new level of wealth. But I was also feeling pretty unhappy at work. I was at my peak professionally, but personally, my life was a mess. My name's Ernest Kane, not Ernie. I came from a hard-working blue-collar family, and high school had been nothing but dull for me. I barely scraped by, mostly because I was disruptive and checked out. My guidance counselor actually advised me to just quit and find a job by some miracle, or maybe just to get rid of me. They handed me a diploma. It was the middle of the Vietnam War, so I enlisted in the Army for a 3-year term. After a year, my father, who was a plumber, thought it would be a good idea to send me to basic training. I surprised everyone, especially myself, by doing really well. I enjoyed the structure and the physical demands, so I volunteered for ranger training, which lasted 2 months. After a grueling 2-month course in Georgia, I was ready for deployment. I wasn't the biggest guy, just under 6 feet and 170 lb, but I was fit thanks to swimming. By the time training was over, I was raring to go. Then it was straight to Vietnam, which was nothing like I'd imagined. I spent over a year and a half there. I was in a veterans hospital for months after a piece of shrapnel hit me, leaving my back and bladder damaged. Thankfully, I was neither incontinent nor too limited by my limp, though I'd carry those scars. Not being able to have kids didn't bother me then, but it would later. I was discharged at 20. I didn't know what to do next, having only combat experience. My dad found a VA counseling program at a nearby university in Raleigh, North Carolina. They ran me through a battery of tests, and Dr. Dyer, a counselor, suggested engineering, pointing out some knack I had, despite my high school record. He gave me a lot of encouragement, and I was soon enrolled at the same university, majoring in electrical engineering, which was a source of pride for my parents. Around that time, I got a call from an old friend, Andy Ernest. It was Andy. I'd just left the Army, so hearing his voice was like a breath of fresh air. I blurted out, "Get out early, where are you?" He chuckled and said, "I stepped on a mine and lost a leg, but I'm doing okay. The prosthesis works great. Call your folks for your number. I'm studying architecture in California now. Can you believe it?" Andy had always been the smartest guy in our unit. I laughed and felt a rush of joy. "I bet my folks told you I'm trying my hand at engineering." We chatted for half an hour, reminiscing and marveling at how we'd both ended up on unexpected paths. I decided to move out on my own, using the GI Bill and a bit of a pension to rent a small studio near campus. It was modest, the room had a bed, a couple of chairs, a tiny kitchen and a bathroom. But it suited me fine. I set up a small study area with a desk and an old computer and focused entirely on my studies. I could walk to class or take a streetcar to visit my parents. The first 2 years flew by, and I did well in my exams, driven by the idea of becoming a real engineer. I was studying so much that I didn't have much of a social life. I made a few friends, though, and would grab a beer or pizza now and then. One Friday, a classmate named Carl invited me to a sorority party at a nearby college. I figured, why not? That night turned out to be a turning point. I met Wendy, a woman who seemed well off. From the moment I saw her, I was drawn to her elegant clothes and diamond studs. She could tell I was judging her, and she seemed a little guilty about it. I grabbed a beer and tried to shake off my assumptions. Our connection deepened, and eventually, we started discussing marriage. I was worried about her reaction to my inability to have kids, but one day, she surprised me by. Wendy said, "Ernest, I love you. I don't want children. I'd be a terrible mother." She was taken aback if that changes things. I understand. I held her close, feeling a weight lift. "Wendy, if that's how you feel, then we're on the same page," I replied, relieved that my own condition didn't need to come up. Wendy was careless with her. Wendy said she'd forgotten to take her birth control pills a few times, but it never mattered. One afternoon, she told me it was time to meet her parents. They lived comfortably in a wealthy part of town. Her dad, Henry Stockton, owned a huge construction firm and was well connected. The day came, and a black Lincoln showed up to take us to there. I was dreading it. I was half sick with nerves, sure they'd see me as unworthy, but her parents were kind. Her mother was polite but reserved, and her dad was a tall, powerful man who insisted I call him Henry. He took a keen interest in my studies and gave me a slap on the back on our way out. "Ernest, I'm impressed. Keep working hard." He said that engineers are always in demand, and gave us his approval on the way back, when he snuggled up to me. I relaxed too, though I knew meeting my folks would be a stark contrast. Her family's grand home versus my parents' small place in rural Pennsylvania would stand out. But my folks were warm, and Wendy seemed a bit surprised by their simple lifestyle. But she was respectful and helped my mom in the kitchen with a roast. My dad took me outside and said, "Ernest, she's great and clearly loves you, but just think engineering might not meet all her expectations." I nodded, letting his words sink in. When we got back inside, my dad raised a toast to Ernest and Wendy. He said, "May your lives be filled with joy." Then, out of the blue, he announced that they were moving to Florida. They'd sold the house to retire there. I was surprised but happy for them. I joked that they'd need a spare room ready for us. Wendy seemed to have some mixed emotions, but she hid them. Wendy and I decided to pool our resources and move into a place together. Her dad even got her a BMW for school. Our last year went by in a flash. Wendy was busy with her studies and wedding planning, and I stayed focused on keeping my grades up. Then, 2 months before graduation, she came home and told me she'd landed a part. I also had the chance to work as an assistant editor at a publishing house. I felt like we didn't have much time at all. I encouraged her, knowing this was a big step for her. Our wedding day came faster than I'd expected. It was held at an upscale hotel with over 200 guests, though only a handful were my own family and friends. I felt like I was floating in a fog, letting the night drift by. Wendy's father, Henry, pulled me aside into a room off the main reception area. He said, "Ernest, I know you've been putting out resumes, but I'd like you to consider working with me. I need to strengthen the technical team, and I want you to train under Donna, our lead electrical engineer. This would be a real position with opportunities to advance. I'll pay you more than any other offer out there." He grinned. I could see this was a golden opportunity, so we shook hands. We agreed that Wendy and I would manage on our own without any strings attached. That was our unspoken deal. My parents gave us a beautiful sterling silver service for 12 settings. That was likely a stretch on their budget. Wendy's parents covered a 10. We went on a day trip to the Bahamas for our honeymoon. I felt awkward accepting such a gift, but declining seemed out of the question. Deep down, I was uneasy about the influence the Stockton family seemed to have over our lives. Wendy knew my feelings about staying independent and brushed off my concerns, but to me they were very real. Our biggest disagreement was where, after we graduated and got married, Wendy wanted to buy a fancy apartment near her new job in Henry's office downtown. I said we should start small and rent a place until we were financially stable enough to buy. Wendy was angry that I wouldn't take her parents' help. I stood firm, and eventually she agreed, though not happily. We settled on a nice 2-bedroom apartment. We ended up with a 2-bedroom, 1-bath apartment that was close to work. Wendy had her car, and I could take a nearby tram line. We went into debt furnishing the place, but I kept an eye on expenses and we made it comfortable. Henry kept his word. The job was challenging but rewarding, and I worked closely with Don Malone, an experienced engineer who taught me a lot. I quickly realized that college had only been the starting line in my career. Many nights I stayed late, eager to learn. Wendy was just as dedicated, moving from assistant to full. Within 2 years, she'd earned a good salary and we'd started saving for a future home. Wendy still longed for a luxury apartment downtown, and sometimes criticized our place, calling it shabby. Once her attitude started grating on me, I stayed in touch with Andy, who kept pushing me to move to California, saying the opportunities were better out there. But I was content where we were, and I knew Wendy had no desire to relocate. Andy persisted, but I couldn't help laughing off his efforts for our second wedding anniversary. I made a reservation at an upscale restaurant, set out 24 roses in a crystal vase, and had a velvet box with diamond earrings ready for Wendy. I had a feeling she thought I'd forgotten since she had brought it up while I waited on the phone. It was Ernest. "I'm so sorry, but I'll be late tonight. There's a lot to finalize for Cole's new novel, and I'll be here for a few more hours. I'll just grab something to eat and be home around 10, she said quickly, hanging up before I could respond. I looked at the roses on the table, wondering if she'd forgotten what today meant. It seemed like her job had become our world, and we'd started drifting. Each of us was buried in work and neglecting our marriage. We felt more like roommates. Wendy had been absorbed in promoting Cole Jensen's book for months, and her excitement about the project had become tiresome to me. I met him once at an event. He was pompous, and Wendy had worn the sleek black dress that evening, which made me uneasy when she introduced me to Cole. He gave me a big handshake, which I quickly returned, and he sneered, calling me the engineer with a mocking laugh. Wendy looked embarrassed. She stayed by his side for the rest of the night, and I couldn't ignore the glances he kept throwing my way. A week later, Wendy stopped talking about him altogether. When I tried to bring him up, she changed the subject. I started to suspect something, but I tried to push it away. Our marriage was running on autopilot, and Wendy seemed distant. We hadn't been intimate in weeks. On our anniversary, I decided to surprise her at work and take her to dinner. I arrived at Harbor Publishing and accidentally got off on the executive floor, where I ran into a familiar face. James Frost, the PE, Ernest. "Good to see you, man. It's been a while." He gave me a friendly pat on the shoulder. "Hey, Jim." I took a wrong turn. "I'm here to surprise Wendy and take her to dinner." I figured she's probably swamped with Cole's project. Jim waved a hand. "Oh, that's wrapped up. Cole's still staying upstairs in a VIP suite, but the books are off too." The printer said, "Get Wendy. She deserves a good night out." He and I walked off. I found Wendy down the hall. When she spotted me, she seemed caught off guard. "Ernest, what are you doing here?" she asked. "I thought I'd take you out for dinner," I replied. "It's been a while." While Wendy and I figured we could spend some time together, she looked annoyed. "I can't, Ernest. I'm busy with Cole's project. Just be patient. This will be over soon, I promise." She gave my cheek a quick pat and hurried back to her office. I left feeling hollow. It was nearly 11, and her promise to be home by 10 felt like just another empty promise. I was frustrated, so I threw the roses vase and all in the trash and stashed the earrings in my desk drawer. I went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I was convinced that she was having an affair with Cole when she finally came home around 1 a.m. morning. I was still fresh out of the shower when I pretended to be asleep. Her behavior only made my suspicions worse. The next morning, I needed some space to think. I went to my office to weigh up my options and decided to hire a private investigator. I found a firm near Stockton Construction and met with Marge DeMarco, an investigator. She listened to my concerns and explained that it would be challenging to get legal evidence from the VIP suite. I wasn't worried about the legalities. I just needed the truth. She looked at me sympathetically. "All right, Ernest. Give us a couple of weeks. Here's the contract. Just sign the fee info sheet, pop it in the post, and we'll get started on Monday." I nodded, shook her hand, and left feeling a sense of relief for finally taking action. When I got home, Wendy was really annoyed. "Ernest, where were you? Do you even remember it's our anniversary? Did you get me a card? Anything?" She was trying to avoid taking responsibility, and I saw right through it. "Wendy," I said calmly, "today's the 11th. Our anniversary was yesterday. The roses I bought are in the trash. I can cancel our dinner reservations. If you look in my desk, you'll find the gift I got you. I suppose staying out until almost 1. It's 12 a.m. M." She froze her eyes, darting them around but not looking at me. After a pause, she exhaled and tried to collect herself. "I'm sorry, Ernest. I don't even know where I half the time this project has worn me down. But it's over now and I want us to focus on our marriage." She didn't realize I already knew the campaign had ended some time ago. Her guilt was all too clear. I chose not to push the argument further, but the tension hung between us for the rest of the week. Wendy was home every evening by 5. This made it clear that her affair with Cole was over, but it was too late for me. The trust was shattered, and our marriage felt like a hollow performance. A few days later, Andy called Ernest to ask if he'd thought any more about moving out here. "There are lots of opportunities here. They'd love a good electrical engineer to move out here." He pressed Andy, who'd been encouraging me to join him for a while. "I'm not sure, Andy, but maybe we can talk about it again soon." Marge DeMarco from the investigation firm called me in. He's got a history with women through 3 settled misconduct complaints and 2 divorces linked to his behavior. "I'm sorry we couldn't give you more clarity." I was disappointed, but resigned soon after. I made an appointment with Oscar Gauss, an attorney, to talk things over in 10 days. In the meantime, Wendy and I barely acknowledged each other, skirting around the tension. Then, just days later, before my appointment with the lawyer, Wendy burst into the house looking frantic. "Ernest, sit down," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to talk to you." She told him they hadn't planned for this, but she was pregnant and they were going to be parents. Her face showed a mix of excitement and dread. "Please, Ernest, don't be angry. Be happy for us," she said. He was stunned and completely blindsided. Then a cold realization washed over him. Wendy had always been careless with her birth control, and now she was trying to pass off Cole's child as mine. I was filled with a complex mix of rage and devastation, leaving me numb. I told her, "I'll get the rest when you're not here. I'll pack a few things, and I'll take care of it." Wendy looked terrified, tears streaming down her face. I said, "I'm sorry, Ernest. You don't know how much I regret. This is why Wendy was so meaningless to you in our marriage." I asked her quietly, and she met my gaze, her eyes red. I asked myself that too. Maybe it was the thrill, the excitement, the glamour of it all. I was weak and foolish, letting myself get swept away by Cole and the job. I didn't realize how far I'd fallen until it was too late. She choked out between sobs. "I know lying about the baby was wrong. I'm really sorry. I've already set up a meeting with Oscar Gauss. Let's get a lawyer and divide our assets to keep things simple." I packed a bag and left, breaking the news to Henry, who was upset. "Ernest, what happened?" "I haven't treated you like family," he asked. "I can't give you all the details, but Wendy will explain. She left me no other option," I said, struggling to keep my emotions in check. Henry studied me. His eyes were damp. "Ernest, do what you need to do. Promise you'll let me help however I can," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder. I nodded, then left, feeling an overwhelming sense of loss for the next week. I stayed at a Hilton trying to get my bearings. I filed for divorce, knowing it would go uncontested. I realized there was nothing left for me here, so I called Andy and booked a flight to Los Angeles. I was on the plane within a week. Andy had already sent my resume to his company, and I started work a few days after arriving. He and his wife, Rachel, let me stay with them while I got settled. I'd only spoken to Rachel on the phone before she welcomed me warmly. She was about 53, striking with dark hair and warm brown eyes. She made me feel like more than just a guest. I was happy for Andy. He'd found a wonderful partner. The days passed, and I threw myself into work, grateful for the distraction. Nights were harder, filled with dark dreams and memories of Wendy. Sometimes I drank too much, venting my anger by smashing a glass or two and then passing out on the couch. I missed the Wendy I had married, not the one who had betrayed me. I wonder if her actions were my fault, but I couldn't forgive her or the situation with the child. Andy and Rachel were a lifeline, inviting me to spend weekends with them or go camping, even trying to set me up on dates, which I avoided spending time with. I was able to regain some peace by going on dates, which I avoided spending time by their pool or sharing meals. Henry and Kate Stockton called occasionally to check in. They were kind, genuine, and touching, and they never mentioned Wendy. Things became a bit awkward with Rachel, though she'd walk around in increasingly revealing bikinis or impy outfits. Sometimes I'd find her in the hallway wearing next to nothing. One Saturday, Andy ran out for beer, insisting I stay. I came out of the bathroom to find Rachel lounging in a silk robe that barely covered anything. She reached for my hand, leading me to the patio. "Rachel, maybe you should tie your rope. Andy will be back soon," I stammered, trying to look away. She smiled, ignoring me. "Ernest, don't worry about Andy," said Ernest. "We need to talk." She sat down opposite me, the robe still open. "Stop feeling sorry for yourself, Ernest. You're not the only guy who's been hurt. You can't keep avoiding women forever." I felt my face flush. Rachel stood up, letting the robe fall completely as she took my hand. "Look, Ernest, I'm not trying to seduce you. Andy and I thought this might shock you back to life." She put the robe back on, tying it. "We did this to look out for you, Ernest. We both want you to move on." My heart pounded. "Rachel, what is Andy going to think about this?" I asked, feeling nervous. Rachel chuckled. "Ernest, Andy trusts me and he trusts you. He's the one who thought this might wake you up when Andy returned. He was all smiles, his humor easing my awkwardness. After that, we got on with it." I reluctantly agreed to some blind dates that they arranged. Surprisingly, many of the women were kind, and I even enjoyed a few of the dates, though I knew none would go anywhere. I still loved Wendy and missed her terribly, and letting go was my biggest struggle. Andy and Rachel kept me anchored, inviting me over frequently. They encouraged me to open up and let my hair down with their company, and weekends by the pool, which helped me unwind. Henry and Kate's calls gave me a feeling of connection to the past. I slowly started finding myself again. I joined a gym, took a cooking class, and even considered joining a book club. Andy and Rachel were thrilled to see me. I started to engage with life again, and slowly, between work and new routines, I felt like I was piecing myself back together after the break with Wendy. 2 years had passed since I moved out to California. I'd been moving through life in a bit of a daze, just going through the motions. Then one Thursday evening, everything changed again. My mom called me. She was in tears. My dad had suffered a massive stroke and was gone. My mind was all over the place, but I knew I needed to stay calm and focused. I called Andy immediately. My dad passed away suddenly. I need you to notify HR and arrange a leave of absence for me, I said, trying to keep it together. Ernest, don't worry about a thing here. Just go and be with your family, he replied with sympathy. Within hours, I was on a plane to Fort Myers, arriving early the next morning. After renting a car, I drove to my parents' house and found a note from our neighbor, Mrs. Turner, asking me to call her. I dialed her number immediately. Mrs. Turner, it's Ernest. I just got your note. Oh, Ernest, your mother had a heart attack right after you called. She was rushed to the hospital, but she'll be all right. Just stay calm, and I'll come over in 5 minutes. Mrs. Turner, or Laura as she preferred, arrived and filled me in on what happened. My mom she said she'd felt pain in her neck and arm, and she'd called an ambulance. My mom was taken to the ER, checked over, and scheduled for bypass surgery later in the week. I was about to rush out the door, but Laura stopped me. She said, "Wait, Ernest, give me 15 minutes, and I'll go with you so you won't get lost." She hugged me and said, Don't worry, your mom's strong, and she'll pull through this. Thanks, Laura. I really appreciate your help. I was grateful for her calm support at the hospital. I finally saw my mom. She was in shock from my dad's passing and initially resisted the idea of surgery. I convinced her that she needed to stick around, at least for we reluctantly agreed to the operation. 5 days later, she had the procedure and made a quick recovery within a week. She was back home, and we started taking short walks around the neighborhood during her hospital stay. I arranged my dad's funeral. The service was well attended, and friends and neighbors were there to mourn. His sudden passing at only 60. I told my mom not to go as she'd just had surgery and said we'd visit his grave when she felt up to it. I stayed with her while I thought about my future. I didn't feel right leaving her on her own after talking with Andy and Rachel. I decided to leave my job, and I moved back to help her. Andy got movers to pack up my things and ship them, including my car. Their support made the transition much easier. My mother's recovery progressed steadily, though she still needed rest in the afternoons with both my help and Laura, who was also recently widowed. She was doing well eventually. I thought it was about time I started looking for work. I told my mom, who surprised me with a suggestion. Ernest, let's start a business together. We could pool our resources. I'd handle the office side and you could manage the technical work. She said it with confidence. Her proposal intrigued me. Small contractors in the area often needed engineering support, and I could see potential in her idea. I called Andy, who gave me the thumbs up. Mom and I pulled our funds together and opened a small office. I placed ads in trade publications and introduced myself to local contractors. Work started to come in, and within a few months we were covering our expenses. We hadn't turned a profit yet, but then a bid request came in for a mid-sized office building. I worked on it for hours, cutting down my profit margin, and landed the contract. I quickly hired help to meet the project deadline. More work followed, and within a few years, we expanded multiple times over. I ended up occupying an entire floor in a new high-rise building. I knew I'd hit the market at the perfect time, just as a building boom took off. Those first few years were all about the business, so I didn't have much time for anything else. After about 3 years, I had enough staff to reduce my hours. I rejoined a gym, hoping to get back in shape. I was trying to get back in shape and even took a cooking class, but I was still hopeless in the kitchen. My mom had to bail me out more than once. One day at the gym, I noticed a woman about my age, Eve Parker, who was around 55, fit and graceful. I noticed her leotard was about to tear along the seam, and I tried to warn her without embarrassing her. Miss Parker, I don't mean to intrude, but I stammered. She smiled, amused, and said, Maybe you should practice a little more before talking. I was trying to get her out of my head. A week later, she approached me. Hi, I'm Eva Parker. Thanks for the heads up last time. She smiled and said, Glad to help. Would you like to grab lunch sometime? I'm Ernest Kane. She accepted, and over the next few weeks we got to know each other. Eva was 28, divorced, and had a 3-year-old daughter. After a few dates, I met Sophia, who worked in public relations at an advertising firm nearby. She was a sweet blonde girl. Eva had a little girl, Sophia, who was a sweet blonde-haired, blue-eyed kid who warmed up to me pretty quickly. Eva was surprised by this, as it seemed like her daughter wasn't one to take to strangers easily. Getting to know Eva felt natural, and I enjoyed our time together. I liked her, but it was different from the intense love I once had for Wendy. I knew I'd changed too. Eva was kind and warm with a spirited personality, especially when it came to Sophia. I grew to care for her as if she were my own. Our relationship was comfortable, but it remained. We were mostly just hanging out and showing each other some affection. But one night after dinner and some wine at Eva's condo, things took a different turn. She was suddenly more forward, and we ended up spending the night together. The next morning, she admitted the wine had loosened her inhibitions, and I reassured her that I had no complaints. Over the following months, our relationship grew more serious, and I introduced Eva and Sophia to my mom. My mom, who is now retired, was delighted to meet them. She took to Sophia and treated her like a grandchild, and it was mutual. Sophia adored Nana, and everything felt just right. Eva and I never discussed marriage or the future. We were content with things as they were. Eventually, it seemed silly for us to keep going back and forth between our places. I bought a house in a quiet gated community, and 2 months later, we moved in together. Marriage never came up. Both of our previous marriages had left scars, and we were happy without making it official. Sophia even started calling me daddy, and I embraced that role fully. Life settled into a good rhythm, and years slipped by. I stayed in touch with Henry and Kate Stockton, talking every so often, and I remained close with Andy and Rachel. Eva's career thrived as well. She climbed to the Director of Public Relations and took on more responsibilities, though that also meant longer hours and occasional travel. Sophia blossomed, calling me daddy, and I embraced that role fully. Life settled into a good rhythm, with years slipping by and blending one into the next. My business flourished, and I built a strong team to help keep things running. I stayed in touch with Henry and Kate Stockton, talking every so often, and remained close with Andy and Rachel. Eva's career also thrived. She was promoted to Director of Public Relations and took on more responsibilities, though that also meant longer hours and occasional travel. Sophia blossomed. Sophia is nearly 20 now, and is finishing her sophomore year at an Ivy League university. Things were going well until recently. Eva seems distant, withdrawn, and distracted. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my imagination, but it became hard to deny that our intimacy, which had once been steady, had become sporadic. We used to be close 2 or 3 times a week, but it had now been nearly 2 weeks since we last spent time together. Eva often brushed me off, saying she was tired or dealing with her period. I started to feel like something was off. I was worried, but I didn't know why. One evening after dinner, I decided to bring it up. Eva, I began softly, we need to talk. I feel like something's changed between us. You seem distant, like I'm not even here. What's going on? I kept my tone gentle, not wanting to sound accusatory. She shot me a glare. What are you talking about? Ernest? Are you paranoid? Are you accusing? I had a feeling something was about to go down. She stomped off, slamming the bedroom door. I stood there, stunned. Eva had never spoken to me like that before. I realized I'd picked up on hints of disrespect, even contempt, from her recently. It wasn't just in my head. I slept in the guest room the next morning. Eva came out, ready to apologize. She explained that stress at work was overwhelming her. She had a big client on the verge of leaving. I nodded, but I wasn't convinced. I decided to get to the bottom of things. Eva's been working late more often and going on business trips too. I had a feeling something was going on, so I hired a private investigator. I gave him the details and a big check over the next few weeks. Eva and I were trying to keep the peace, but we were avoiding each other. I was ready for the investigator's report. I was right. Eva was meeting a man named Bill Barnes, who was 48. A year. Eva and Bill had been divorced for a while. They met for dinners, held hands, kissed, and checked into hotels together. She even saw him on her work trips. It was a painful time, but not as bad as my first heartbreak. I knew I couldn't handle this betrayal, so I spoke to my lawyer about a separation. We weren't legally married, but he assured me he said it could be handled outside of court, but advised a mutual agreement to keep things simple. The following Friday after dinner, I confronted Eva. I asked her how long she'd been seeing him. Her face fell and tears welled up as she whispered, "I'm sorry, Ernest. I hoped you wouldn't find out." I asked her how long she'd been seeing him. She said, 8 months. Name, Bill Barnes. Do you love him? My voice was calm, but inside I was reeling. She dropped her head, her voice choked with emotion. About 8 months ago, he became Sophia's biological father. The words hit me like a blow. Sophia's father. No, I'm Sophia's father. I exploded. No one's going to take that away from me. Eva was crying and visibly shaken. You are her father, Ernest. I just meant he's the one who. Do you love him? I interrupted, barely able to contain my anger. I don't know. She sobbed. It felt like it did when we first met, when we were married. I couldn't say no. My anger faded, replaced by a hollow disappointment. Eva was a different person now, and I felt like I was back where I started with another failed relationship. I told her to move out as soon as possible. We should tell people we've drifted apart. I felt old and weary as I left the room the next morning. I went to work trying to focus but feeling detached. When I got home, Eva was gone. She'd taken most of her things, leaving behind a letter. Dearest Ernest, I'm really sorry for the pain I've caused you. You did nothing to deserve this, and my actions have no justification. I can't explain why I felt drawn to Bill. I know it'll ruin me again, but it's like an addiction. I can't escape. I promised myself I wouldn't, but I've broken that promise. I'm not sure I can keep that promise, but I've been meaning to see him again. You've been really great to me, and I've come to love you a lot, which makes this even worse. Please, don't hate me with all my love, Eva. I dropped into a chair and let the letter fall to the floor. I knew I'd miss Eva, but I also felt a strange relief. I needed time alone. I needed to clear my head, but a thought kept coming back to me. I couldn't let Bill mess up our lives anymore. I had his address, so I decided to confront him that night. I changed clothes and drove to his shabby apartment building. When he opened the door, I shoved him back and closed the door behind me. He yelled, "I'll make you regret it." I grabbed him and pulled him up, looking him in the eye. I said, "Listen carefully, Bill. My name is Ernest Kane. The woman you've been seeing is my partner, Eva. I'm going to make this hurt, but I won't leave any marks," I warned him. Over the next 20 minutes, I made sure he'd remember this encounter when he was in trouble. I poured a glass of water, splashed it in his face, and then let him drink, looking him dead in the eye. I told him to pack up and leave. Try the West Coast, California, Oregon, or Washington. If you're still here in 24 hours, I knew he understood. He nodded vigorously. I drove home, showering for half an hour, feeling both sickened and strangely sad, but satisfied. I tried to rationalize that I'd done it for Eva's sake, but deep down I knew it was partly revenge. I shook off the guilt and resolved to move on. Bill disappeared the next day. The day I spent talking with my mom and Sophia was tough. They didn't understand what I was going through, and I avoided telling them the full truth. Sophia threatened to come home, but Eva and I convinced her to stay at school. When I spoke to Sophia next, her voice was subdued. "I'll always love you, Dad," she said softly. I was able to keep moving forward, even though I was still dealing with the fallout from what had happened. I had to make a big decision about the company. Should I sell or not? There was a potential buyer interested, but he wanted an answer soon. He was patient and encouraging, but he also set a deadline that was quickly approaching. I kept putting it off, torn between freedom and the responsibility that gave my life purpose. I was torn between freedom and the responsibility that gave my life purpose. A week before the deadline, I made my decision. I would keep the company. Months went by, and I became more introspective. I was nearing 50, and I had to ask myself, what did I have to show for it? A thriving company and a wonderful daughter, in almost every sense of the word. Sophia called every week without fail. Otherwise, I led a quiet life. I missed Eva, but in a distant way. We'd shared good years, but we'd moved on. The last I heard, Eva was advancing in her career and dating someone. I didn't mind being alone. I'd grown used to it. Ernest was my secretary. Ted said over the intercom, "You have a visitor." I was buried in specs for an upcoming project and fully focused on that. "Ted, I'm swamped. Can you handle it?" She persisted. "I think you'll want to see him." "Ernest, it's Henry Stockton." I froze, then shot up from my desk and rushed out to the lobby. Standing there was Henry Stockton, tall and white. He was bald and looked a lot younger than his 70 years. Some years I've embraced him, feeling a lump in my throat. "Okay, Ernest, let me breathe," I said. He laughed. I stepped back, still amazed to see him. We'd kept in touch, but I hadn't seen him in over 20 years. I quickly led him into my office and we settled in, catching up on each other's lives. I knew he told me he'd sold his business, and that he and Kate had finally moved to Clearwater. They'd talked about it for years, but on a whim they'd flown down, fallen in love with a place on the Gulf, and bought it on the spot. Henry asked about my company and why I hadn't decided to sell after all. I explained my reasons. "Ernest, you know why I'm keeping the company." Henry nodded in understanding. "Ernest, you're so close to us now, you've got to come visit." "Kate would be hurt if you didn't," he said with a smile. Turns out a few lucky breaks were all it took to turn things around. I noticed a twinkle in his eyes and suddenly it dawned on me. My God, how had I missed it? Turns out, Henry had been behind those early opportunities. Flustered, I stammered out my gratitude, but he just waved it off. "I only called in a few favors. You took those chances and built something incredible." "Something incredible? Your company's success is down to your hard work and skill. I didn't do much at all." We fell into a quiet pause, and I sensed he was waiting for something. I knew exactly what it was, and I was curious too. I'd been wondering for years, but I was afraid to ask. "It was time, Henry." I said slowly, "How's Wendy? Is she doing well? I truly hope she's found happiness." He leaned back, exhaling softly. "I've waited a long time for you to ask. Ernest, thank you for Kate and for me." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "It's been many years since you left, and Wendy's life has changed, but it wasn't an easy road for her." I braced myself, thinking of her child now an adult. I expected to hear she'd remarried, maybe built a family. I dreaded that thought more than I wanted to admit. Ernest, Henry continued, "Wendy lost the baby shortly after you left. There were complications and the doctor said she was unable to conceive again. She had already quit her job at the publishing house and the divorce, miscarriage, everything. It left her clinically depressed. But this was not your fault, so don't carry that burden." Wendy blamed herself and called it her own foolishness. It took months of therapy. To rebuild her life, she became more mature and in many ways compassionate. I didn't know what to say. The news left me shaken and my emotions were all over the place. Even after all this time, Wendy still stirred something in me. Henry shifted in his seat when Wendy was finally on the list of men she told us she'd been seeing. She wanted to go to medical school, which we were pretty shocked about. We thought it was part of her depression, but she was pretty insistent that it was something she'd thought through. Long story short, she enrolled at Duke University School of Medicine in North Carolina and became an MD, specializing in pediatric oncology. She knew she decided to dedicate her life to helping others by having children. I was amazed at how the woman I knew as an editor had transformed into a doctor caring for children with cancer. It felt surreal. Henry went on explaining that Wendy's determination had brought her to this point. Then he looked at me with "Ernest, do you know why Kate and I moved here?" The main reason was to be closer to Wendy. She's taken up a position as the chief of pediatric oncology at the cancer center at the university here in Fort Myers. She's been in the role for a few months now. I felt my heart race. Wendy was here in Fort Myers. Part of me wanted to meet her, but I didn't. I didn't know what emotions that might stir. "Does she know you're here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "She doesn't," Henry chuckled. "She'd be upset if she knew I'd suggested it. But I think she was aware you live here, which probably influenced her decision. It wasn't that she didn't want to see you. She just didn't want to complicate your life." I was trying to process everything Henry had just told me. Wendy was nearby, working as a doctor and possibly open to reconnecting. Henry noticed my confusion, and he stood up. "Ernest, I know this is a lot to take in and think about. I'll be in touch." I walked him to the door and went back to my desk. I asked Ted to hold my calls. I had a lot to process. Wendy was here in Fort Myers. My pulse raced as questions crowded my mind. Did I still love her? I had to ask myself if I even knew her anymore. These were questions I'd avoided for years, and now they demanded answers. I couldn't deny it. I loved the Wendy I'd married. But what did I feel for the woman she had become? I knew I had to see her and talk to her to find out for myself. In the following weeks, I kept in touch with Henry, visiting him and Kate in Clearwater. Wendy wasn't there during my visits, but I sensed that part of me hoped she would be. I wanted to see her, but I was also afraid of what I might feel or not feel. It was unsettling. One Saturday, Kate called to invite me down for the day. I packed a bag, put on a clean shirt, and made the drive. When I arrived, I let myself in and called their names in the sunroom. I saw a familiar figure by the glass doors. My heart skipped. It was Wendy, standing about 20 feet away, backlit by sunlight. She hadn't changed. She was still slim, poised, and well-groomed. I made sure I was looking my best as I approached, and we stood there just taking each other in. "Wendy," I said softly. She gave me a gentle smile and said hello. "It's good to see you." She extended her hand and we shook as if meeting for the first time. In a way we were. "Ernest," she continued. "My parents didn't. I asked them to let me come. I wanted to see you. I hope you're not upset with them or me." "No, of course not." We moved to the sunroom, settling onto a white wicker couch by a low glass coffee table. The conversation started off a bit awkward, with long pauses, but we soon relaxed and got into a comfortable rhythm. Wendy shared stories about her medical career, and I filled her in on my life. She already knew about Eva thanks to her parents. As we spoke, my mind was running on 2 tracks. On one level, I engaged in the conversation, and on another, I was observing Wendy, trying to understand this new person she'd become. She looked great. She was wearing a simple polo shirt and khaki shorts. Her legs were tanned. Her hair was shorter than I remembered, with faint lines around her eyes and mouth. There was a calmness about her, a maturity that hadn't been there before. She exuded confidence and a quiet assurance. This was no longer the Wendy I had married or divorced. This was a whole new woman, and I realized I wanted to get to know her. We spent the day talking, having lunch and lounging by the pool. I felt myself warming to her again, for reasons that were both familiar and entirely new. It was nearly as the sun was setting. I noticed it was getting late. I asked Wendy if she wanted to have dinner with me the next day. She smiled and said she'd love to. I told her I was scheduled at the center that night, but that I'd really enjoy having dinner with her the next day. We made plans, and over the next couple of weeks, we began dating. I knew I still loved her, maybe even more now, but we were taking things slowly. We ended our evenings with soft, respectful kisses. I didn't know where this would lead, but for the first time in years, I felt hopeful.